Elias Turner had never been the kind of man who put himself first. Most days, his reflection in the mirror was just a reminder that time and exhaustion had learned his face better than he ever did. Every wrinkle told a story, not of age, but of sacrifice. He worked 2 jobs, both hard, both quiet. One at a grocery store stocking shelves before dawn, the other driving for a delivery service till late at night. And yet his real job, the one that mattered most, began and ended with a 7-year-old girl named Lena. Lena was laughter, and light rolled into one small body, with curls that refused to stay tied and questions that never ran out. She didn't know how little they had. Elias made sure of that. To her, their 1-bedroom apartment in the worn-down part of Philadelphia was home, warm, and safe. To him, it was proof that love could live even in the smallest corners. But tonight was different. He stood by the cracked bathroom mirror, smoothing down the sleeves of a shirt that had been ironed more times than it had been worn. The collar was clean, the buttons slightly mismatched. His hands trembled as he tugged at the fabric. It wasn't fancy, but it was the best he owned. And for the first time in years, it mattered how he looked, because Elias Turner, the man who hadn't gone on a single date in nearly 8 years, had one tonight. The idea still felt absurd. Someone online had laughed at one of his clumsy jokes about burnt toast and long workdays. Her name was Marissa, and her words had made him smile on nights when silence sat too heavy. She said she liked simple men. She said she wanted real. He had believed her. Elias checked the envelope he kept tucked inside a shoebox under the bed. Inside was exactly $137, his emergency fund, the one he swore he would only touch if something broke or someone got sick. But tonight he took out $50 to remind himself he was still alive. $50 can buy hope, he whispered under his breath. Just once, that's enough. By the time he reached the small restaurant on Maple Avenue, the cold had already worked its way into his bones. The sign above the door flickered unevenly, the Blue Willow Cafe, a modest place with soft music and warm lighting that made strangers look kinder. As he stepped inside, the scent of baked bread and roasted garlic greeted him. The hostess smiled politely, and for a moment, Elias felt almost invisible, not because she ignored him, but because the world around him looked too perfect, too polished. He followed her to a small table by the window. A candle flickered weakly between the silverware, and outside, flakes of snow began to drift past the glass. It looked like the kind of night that might belong in someone else's story, not his. He glanced around, feeling the tight pull of nerves in his chest. Couples filled the tables, people leaning close, laughing, touching hands, ordering wine they could pronounce. He checked his phone again. 6:55 p.m., Marissa was late. He smiled to himself, just a little, thinking maybe she was parking, maybe fixing her hair. Maybe she wanted to make a good impression, too. By 7:15, the smile had faded. His water glass had been refilled twice, and he'd memorized every pattern on the folded napkin. Still, hope clung stubbornly to his chest. When the restaurant door opened again, he looked up. Once, twice, then again. Every time someone else walked in. Someone else who wasn't her. He scrolled through his phone, his thumb hovering over their last message. "Can't wait to see you tonight." He typed, "I'm here. Just checking in." Then waited. 3 minutes. 5. 10. When the screen finally lit up, his heart lifted. But then he read it. "Wait, you actually showed up?" "Lol, I was kidding. Not really my type. You seem sweet, but no need to waste your gas money." Another message blinked in seconds later. "Seriously, though, didn't think you'd go for it." No hard feelings. The words hit harder than they should have. Not because they were cruel, but because they confirmed what he secretly feared. He had been foolish enough to believe he deserved more than survival. The world around him didn't pause. Plates clinked, laughter echoed, wine poured. Elias just sat there, hands clasped, phone face down, heart sinking. He forced himself to swallow. The sting in his eyes burned, but he blinked it away. Men like him didn't cry in restaurants. They just tightened their jaw, cleared their throat, and pretended they were fine. The server approached with a careful smile. "Would you like to order, sir?" Elias hesitated. "Not yet. I'm waiting." The lie caught in his throat like a splinter. He opened his wallet under the table, a single 22 fives and a few coins. He thought about leaving, but something in him refused. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was pain. Or maybe it was the smallest flicker of defiance. The belief that he could still sit here. That being stood up didn't erase his worth. Across the room, a woman watched. Her name was Camille Ross, mid-30s, sharp yet serene. The kind of woman whose presence quieted a room without effort. She was seated at a corner table, her tablet closed beside an untouched cup of chamomile tea. Camille wasn't there for company. She was there to breathe. After 12 hours at the headquarters of her company, Ross Organics, she had promised herself one evening of stillness, but as she glanced toward the man by the window, his posture too straight, his hands clasped like he was holding himself together, stillness suddenly felt impossible. He wasn't scrolling aimlessly or hiding behind his phone. He was waiting. And she could see the way waiting turned into realization. The exact second hope left his eyes. She noticed it, and it did something to her. She knew disappointment. She had lived it in silence and in headlines, in boardrooms where she smiled while others doubted her. But this was different. His kind of disappointment wasn't professional. It was human. Camille looked down at her untouched plate, then at him again. He hadn't ordered. He was just sitting, a quiet ache pressed against her ribs. She signaled to the server, her voice soft. "Can I get another plate of your roasted pasta and lemonade?" The server nodded. "For him," she added before the words could hesitate. "And put it on my bill. Don't tell him until after." The waiter froze, then nodded with a knowing smile. When the plate arrived, Elias frowned, shaking his head. "I didn't order this." The server smiled faintly. "Someone took care of it for you." Elias blinked, confused, suspicion flickering across his face. Another joke? Another setup? Before he could speak, a calm voice behind him said, "It's not a prank. Just dinner." He turned. Camille stood there, confident, warm, eyes kind but steady. Her voice carried no pity, only truth. "You deserve to eat, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise." The words landed with the weight of grace. Elias stared at her, speechless. For years he had heard every version of keep pushing, man up, be strong, but never this, never the quiet reminder that he deserved something simple, something good. Camille nodded toward the empty chair across from him. "Mind if I join you?" Elias could only nod. For a moment, silence sat between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The clinking glasses and soft jazz faded around them like the world knew better than to interrupt. Finally, he whispered, "You didn't have to do that." She smiled gently. "I know, that's why it matters." The candlelight flickered between them. Two strangers, one act of kindness, and 1,000 unspoken stories crossing paths in the space of a single meal. He didn't know how long he sat there after that, only that the food before him had grown warm and fragrant, and that for the first time in a very long time he felt seen. He twirled the fork slowly, hesitant, almost afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too fast. The first bite broke through more than hunger. It cracked open something he had buried under years of responsibility and silence. Camille watched quietly, her chin resting against her hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. "I used to think success meant never needing anyone. Then I realized sometimes the most successful thing we can do is let someone care." Elias swallowed hard. "I'm not used to that," he said. "People helping?" "That's because you've been busy helping everyone else." He looked down, the fork trembling in his fingers. No one had ever said that to him. Not his boss, not his friends, not even his late wife before she passed 7 years ago from an illness they never could afford to treat properly. For years, he'd been moving through life as if his only purpose was to keep everything from falling apart. They talked until the restaurant began to thin out. Trading stories not of victories but of little survivals. How Camille once slept in her car for a week when her startup collapsed. How Elias learned to braid his daughter's hair using YouTube tutorials. How both of them had spent years pretending not to feel lonely. When the check came, Camille waved it away before he could reach for it. "Consider it my thank you," she said. "For what?" "For reminding me that kindness still feels real." She slid a small card across the table. Plain white, embossed letters, Camille Ross, CEO, Ross Organics. He blinked at it, unsure if it was a joke. She only smiled. "Sometimes I come here to think," she said. "If you ever feel like being seen again, come by. I don't promise fancy food, but the coffee's good." He nodded, speechless. By the time he found words, she was already gone, leaving behind the faintest trace of lavender and something like peace. A week later, he found himself walking into a cafe he'd never noticed before. The bell over the door chimed softly, and there she was, Camille, sitting by the window, laptop open, sleeves rolled up, looking less like a CEO and more like someone who finally had time to breathe. "You remembered me?" she said with a smile. "You fed me. Hard to forget." She laughed, and the sound loosened something in his chest. "Coffee? Only if you promise not to pay this time." "We'll see." As they sat, conversation flowed like water, easy, effortless. He told her about Lena's drawings taped to the fridge, about how he sometimes read bedtime stories out loud even when she was already asleep. She told him about the first investor who told her she'd fail because no one wanted organic baby food from a woman who never had kids. By the time they parted that day, it felt less like two strangers meeting again and more like two roads quietly merging. A few days later, a message appeared on his phone. "Thought this might interest you?" No pressure. Camille. Attached was a digital pass to a community workshop on childhood nutrition sponsored by her company. He hesitated. He wasn't a scientist or a chef, just a dad who knew what it meant to stretch groceries for the week. But the words "no pressure" stuck with him, and so did her voice. He went. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee. Doctors, nutritionists, and young parents filled the seats, notebooks open, eyes bright. Elias sat in the back, hands folded, thinking maybe he'd made a mistake coming. Then the speaker asked if anyone had questions. Before he realized it, his hand was up. "What about parents who can't cook everything fresh?" His voice wavered, but he kept going. "Sometimes it's either frozen meals or nothing. How do we make the right choice when time and money are both tight?" The room went quiet, then the speaker smiled. "That's the most honest question I've heard all day." Camille, sitting off to the side, watched as every head turned toward him. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to sound smart. He was just telling the truth. After the workshop, he slipped out quietly, heading across the street to the library where Lena waited. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her hair full of colorful beads, a stack of books beside her. When she saw him, she jumped up, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Daddy!" Her joy washed the day off him like rain. He lifted her easily, breathing in the scent of cocoa butter and crayons. Then she froze mid-hug. "Daddy," she whispered. "That's the lady from the restaurant." Elias turned. Camille stood a few steps away, hesitant but smiling. Lena's voice dropped to a whisper, eyes wide. "She smells like Mommy's perfume." The air shifted, soft but heavy. Elias blinked fast, the sting returning to his throat. Camille crouched to meet Lena's eyes. "That's a beautiful thing to say," she said gently. "Your mom must have had good taste." Lena nodded, serious as only a child could be, then went back to her coloring books as if the universe hadn't just held its breath. Elias exhaled, voice low. "She doesn't say things like that often." Camille looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, she saw not just a tired man, but a father who had kept love alive in the smallest ways. Something inside her softened completely. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about them. She began finding reasons to reach out. Sometimes it was about work, sending him draft labels, asking, "Would a parent like you actually trust this?" Sometimes it was no reason at all, Just a message, a check-in, a small hello. Elias never quite understood how easily she became part of their rhythm. When he was stuck late at the store, she'd drop by with takeout. When Lena's school closed early, she'd pick her up and spend the afternoon helping with homework. Lena adored her. Camille never arrived empty-handed, sometimes with coloring books, sometimes with stories, always with patience. Then one night, Lena fell ill. Elias stood by the couch, panic tightening his chest as the child's small body shivered under blankets. The soup on the stove burned slightly as he paced. When the soft knock came, he barely heard it. Camille entered quietly, her expression calm but her eyes full of care. "It's okay," she said softly. "Let me help." She knelt beside Lena, pulling a lavender compress from her bag and laying it across the little girl's forehead. Then she began to hum, soft, rhythmic, familiar. Elias froze. The melody twisted through the room like memory itself. His late wife used to hum that song. He sank into the nearest chair, his hands over his face as tears spilled freely, soundless but deep. He hadn't cried like that in years. Camille's voice wavered for just a moment when she saw him, but she kept humming until Lena's breathing steadied. Then she turned toward him. "I didn't know," he whispered. "You didn't have to tell me," she said gently. "Some things find their way back on their own," he nodded, unable to speak. From that night on, something between them shifted quietly, like a tide changing direction without anyone noticing until the shore looked different, and neither of them tried to stop it. The days that followed settled into something that felt dangerously close to peace. Camille still ran her company with precision, but her evenings now ended at Elias's apartment, where Lena would be sprawled on the floor with crayons, her laughter echoing through the small space. Elias cooked. Camille read out loud, and for the first time in years, the apartment felt like a home instead of a place people returned to out of habit. Elias told himself not to hope too much. He had learned that hope could be expensive. But every time Camille looked at him, not as a man trying to survive, but as someone worth standing beside, hope became harder to resist. Then the letter came. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a thin white envelope, folded neatly between bills and coupons. He almost threw it away. When he finally opened it, the words blurred for a second before they sank in. "Congratulations. You've been accepted to the Allied Health Training Program in Portland, Oregon. Full scholarship, 1-year certification." He sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper, heart pounding. This was what he'd dreamed about in quiet moments, the chance to do more, to build something lasting for Lena. But behind the pride, fear crawled in. Portland was 3,000 miles away. That evening, he found Camille waiting outside the small park where Lena chased bubbles with other kids. She looked up from her phone, reading his face instantly. "Something happened," she said. He handed her the letter without a word. As she read, her expression softened. "Elias, this is incredible." He nodded, but his voice cracked when he said, "It means leaving." "A year away?" "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," she interrupted softly. "You're telling me you're about to change your life. That's not something you apologize for." He looked at her, confused. She smiled faintly. "Loving someone doesn't mean keeping them still. It means letting them grow, even if it hurts." He wanted to argue, to tell her that the thought of leaving her felt like walking out of sunlight. But her eyes were calm, and in them he saw not loss, but faith. When the day came for him to leave, the apartment was nearly empty, boxes stacked by the door. Camille came over quietly, holding a paper bag filled with dinner and a small box of craft paper. Together, the three of them, Elias, Camille, and Lena, made a paper chain, each loop marking 1 week until his return. Lena giggled as the chain grew long, her small fingers careful with each fold. When she reached the last loop, she wrote in uneven letters, "Daddy comes home." Later that night, as Elias knelt to hug her goodbye, she ran to Camille instead, pressing her face into the woman's shoulder. "You're not far," she whispered. "Daddy says hearts don't care about distance." Camille closed her eyes, holding her close. When she looked up, Elias was watching, tears shining but unshed. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. A year passed. Portland was gray and relentless with rain, but Elias didn't mind. He studied harder than anyone else in the program, every late-night shift and early morning fueled by the image of his daughter's paper chain and Camille's steady eyes. When he finally earned his certification, he stood outside the hospital doors, holding the ID badge that read, Elias Turner, Medical Technician. It felt like standing at the edge of a new world. That same morning, an envelope waited on his desk, cream-colored, the handwriting unmistakable. Invitation, Ross Organics product launch, Rooftop Garden, 3:00 p.m. When he arrived, the city stretched out beneath strings of lights and soft music. Tables lined the terrace, covered with small jars of baby food, labeled Her First Spoon. Beneath the logo, the tagline read, For the women who stayed hungry to feed hope. He felt something twist in his chest. At the podium, Camille stood in a pale blue dress, her voice carrying steady over the hum of the crowd. She spoke about nourishment and dignity, about single parents who sacrificed quietly, about how strength wasn't loud but constant. Then her gaze found him. The crowd blurred. It was just them. When the applause faded, she made her way toward him, every step measured, every second drawn tight with meaning. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said, her voice trembling just a little. I wasn't sure you'd want me here, he replied. She smiled, a real one this time. Impossible. From her pocket, she drew a small velvet box. She didn't kneel, didn't make a scene. She just opened it. A simple silver band, modest but certain. I don't want to save you, she said softly. I just want to stay. He couldn't speak. He could only nod. Yes. That night, they returned to the same cafe where everything had begun. The candlelight flickered just like before. But the table by the window was no longer a place of waiting. It was a table of belonging. Lena sat between them, coloring in her notebook, her laughter bubbling through the air. When the server came, the same one who had once placed a plate before a lonely man, he smiled knowingly. Good to see you again, sir, he said. Elias smiled back. Good to be seen. Camille leaned close, her hand brushing his. Order whatever you want tonight. We eat for the man who once waited, and the little girl who believed in him. Lena giggled, pulling out a folded paper from her backpack. Look, she said proudly. On the page were 3 stick figures at a table under a roof with a yellow door. This is us, Daddy, Mommy, Camille, and me. Elias's throat tightened. He looked at the drawing, then at the 2 faces before him. One woman who had given back his dignity, one child who had given him purpose. He thought about the man who had once walked into this cafe with $50 and a fragile kind of hope. That man had believed the world had already decided what he deserved. Now he knew better. The candlelight glowed between them, steady and warm. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft. Forgiving new, Elias took Camille's hand, looked at Lena and smiled. Looks like the story turned out okay after all. And for the first time in his life, he truly believed it. The snow kept falling that night. Thick and silent, the city lights turning every flake into gold. Inside the cafe, time seemed to slow. Elias sat back, watching Lena and Camille talk softly, their laughter blending into the hum of the room. Something about it didn't feel new. It felt inevitable, like all the lonely years had been leading here. When they finally left, the cold hit them in a rush. Camille wrapped Lena's scarf tighter, then looked at Elias with a smile that said everything words never could. You finally look rested, she murmured. Maybe I am, he said quietly. Maybe for the first time. Life after that didn't become perfect, it became real. Elias's days at the hospital were long, often exhausting. He worked with families like his own, people who had learned how to keep moving even when life offered them little. Every time he handed a parent a blanket, or stayed an extra hour to translate medical instructions for someone nervous and confused, he thought of Camille's words. You deserve to eat. Even when the world tries to tell you otherwise, He came home to warmth. Camille's voice filled the apartment, her shoes by the door next to Lena's tiny sneakers. The paper chain still hung on the wall, faded now, some loops crinkled, but no one had the heart to take it down. It was proof of waiting that had been worth it. A year later, Ross Organics launched a new initiative, free community kitchens for single parents. Camille refused to take credit publicly. When reporters asked how the idea came to her, she just smiled. From someone who reminded me that kindness doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. She didn't need to say his name. Everyone who mattered already knew. Elias, meanwhile, had started something of his own. In a small corner of the hospital cafeteria, he kept a shelf stocked with packed lunches labeled, "Take if you need." He funded it quietly, no logos, no announcements. One afternoon, a young nurse asked why he did it. He shrugged and said, "Someone once bought me dinner when I couldn't afford to buy it for myself." By spring, the cafe where they first met had changed hands, but the corner table by the window was still there. The new owner found a framed photo left behind by the previous manager, a picture of 3 smiling faces, the little girl with braids, her parents' hands linked across the table. Underneath it, someone had scribbled in neat handwriting, "For those who wait and are still found." Lena grew fast. Too fast, Elias sometimes thought. She started asking big questions about love, about loss, about why people hurt and still keep trying anyway. He didn't always have answers, but Camille did. Together, they taught her that love wasn't something you searched for. It was something you built piece by piece, meal by meal, choice by choice. On the 5th anniversary of the night, everything changed. They went back to the Blue Willow Cafe. The sign had been repainted, the tables replaced, but the smell of baked bread was the same. Lena, now tall enough to see over the table, placed 3 menus down herself. "Same table," she said. "Same story," Elias grinned. "Maybe a new chapter." Camille reached for his hand, the faint silver band still shining on her finger. "No," she whispered. "Just the same story, still being written." Lena pulled out a drawing, a new one. This time it wasn't stick figures. She had grown into detail, faces, colors, even the glow of a candle. In the center, 3 people sat together under a sky filled with falling snow. At the bottom, she had written in careful cursive, "Hope looks like this." Elias felt the familiar ache in his chest, but it wasn't pain. It was gratitude. He remembered that first night, the humiliation, the waiting, the cruel words on the phone. He remembered how small he'd felt, how the world had seemed to shrink around him. Now everything felt wide again. Camille caught his eye, a quiet understanding passing between them. No rescue, no fairy tale, just 2 lives rebuilt from scraps of grace. Outside, the city kept moving, cars hissing through slush, laughter spilling from sidewalks, but at that little table by the window, time stood still again. Elias raised his glass, his voice soft but sure. "To waiting," he said. Camille smiled. "To finding," Lena giggled. "To us." And for the rest of the night, the 3 of them stayed there, talking, laughing, remembering. The candle burned low, the snow kept falling, and somewhere between the quiet and the light, love settled in like it had never left. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't luck. It was simply 2 people and 1 little girl, proving that sometimes even the smallest act of kindness can rewrite an entire life. And as the cafe door closed behind them, the world outside seemed just a little softer, a little kinder, and a little more like home. That winter turned into spring, and the quiet rhythm of their days became something sacred. Elias would wake before sunrise, make breakfast, and watch Lena braid her own hair now, her fingers nimble and sure. Camille would hum softly as she checked her phone for early calls, then slip it face down when Lena spoke, because nothing at that table mattered more than that small voice. But beneath all the peace, life had one more test to offer. It started with a phone call late one night. Elias had fallen asleep on the couch, Lena's blanket tangled around his legs. Camille picked up her phone and stepped into the kitchen. When she returned, her expression had changed. Calm on the surface, but the quiet kind of calm that meant something was breaking underneath. "What is it?" Elias asked, sitting up. "It's Ross Organics," she said slowly. "There's been an issue. A recall on one of our new lines. A shipment went out with labeling errors. Potential allergens." "It's bad, Elias. Really bad." He stood, crossing to her. "Can you fix it?" Her eyes glistened. "If I can't, everything I've built could fall apart. Investors, employees, reputation. It's all on the line." He reached for her hand. "Then we fix it. Together." The next days blurred into chaos. Camille barely slept, fielding calls, visiting warehouses, facing reporters. The headlines came fast. Ross Organics, recall shakes trust. Social media tore her apart. Elias watched helplessly, wanting to take the burden, but all he could do was be steady. Every night he left soup on the stove, hot towels by her chair. Every morning he drove Lena to school so Camille could face another round of meetings. A week later, at a press conference, Camille stood before flashing cameras, her voice raw but unshaken. "We made a mistake," she said, "and I take full responsibility. We will make it right, not to protect our name, but because families deserve better." Her honesty stunned everyone. By the next morning, instead of outrage, messages of support poured in. People remembered what her company had stood for. Parents shared stories of how her affordable meals had helped them. Trust, the thing she feared she'd lost forever, began to return, not through strategy, but through truth. When she came home that night, exhausted, Elias met her at the door. "You did it," he whispered. "I didn't," she said, her voice cracking. "We did." He pulled her close, the kind of embrace that carried every unspoken thing they had both fought for: dignity, honesty, love. Months later, the company had not only survived, but grown stronger. Camille started a new division focused on low-income family programs. She named it Turner Initiatives. When Elias saw the sign on the new office door, he was too stunned to speak. "It's for you," she said softly. "For the man who showed me what strength actually looks like." He took her hand, eyes wet. "Camille!" But she only shook her head. "Don't thank me. Just keep being that man." Years passed, and the city around them changed. Lena grew taller, her laughter deeper, her drawings now covering the walls. One, in particular, hung above their kitchen table, a picture of 3 hands holding one another under a line of text written in bright blue crayon. "Love is when no one eats alone." On a warm June evening, Elias sat on the front steps of their home watching the sunset. The street was quiet, children's laughter echoing somewhere down the block. Camille stepped outside, 2 cups of tea in hand, her hair glowing gold in the fading light. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. He smiled. "Every day." "You almost didn't come, you know." "I almost didn't," he admitted. "But something told me to show up anyway." "That's something," she said, settling beside him. "Changed my whole life." They sat in silence. The kind that only comes when words have already done their work. Lena's laughter floated through the open window behind them, her voice reading aloud to herself. Elias leaned back, looking at the sky fading from blue to amber. "Funny," he said after a while. "I used to think $50 was all I had left. Turns out it was just the first thing I invested in hope." Camille smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And it paid the best return I've ever seen." He chuckled quietly, the sound low and full. "You're still a CEO, even in love." She laughed, too. "Someone's got to keep us profitable." The sun dipped low, the air turning soft and warm. Elias turned to her, eyes reflecting the last of the light. "You know, I think the world is full of people sitting at tables, waiting for someone who'll never come. Maybe if more of us looked up once in a while, we'd see them." Camille nodded slowly. "And maybe we'd remember that the smallest kindness can change everything." He took her hand, holding it tightly. "It changed me. And somewhere in that quiet, where the sound of Lena's reading mingled with the evening breeze, they understood something simple and true. The story that had started with rejection had become a lifetime of belonging. There was no grand ending, No curtain falling, just the steady hum of love living in ordinary moments. A meal shared, a laugh exchanged, a light left on. And as the stars blinked awake above them, Elias thought of every man sitting alone in some restaurant tonight, waiting, doubting, folding his napkin just to keep his hands busy. He hoped that somewhere, someone like Camille was watching, someone who believed enough to say, "You deserve to eat, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise, because sometimes that's all it takes for a quiet miracle to begin again."